Hello everybody, welcome to MyBoxxCollective, this is BrainBoxx. We all know the world is in financial turmoil right now, and some people are even calling this the start of a recession, but what does that actually mean? To try and make the global financial crisis a little bit clearer, I'm going to be explaining why this has happened, what we are trying to do to fix it, and how this is going to affect us in the future. Firstly, why? A loan is where a bank gives a person money and that person has to pay back that money over a period of time with interest. It used to be that banks were very strict as to whom they gave loans. They had to check that you were definitely capable of paying back the money by looking at things like how much money you earned and how reliable you were at paying back loans in the past. This all changed about a decade or so ago when American banks started encouraging people with lower incomes who couldn't really pay back large amounts of money to take out big loans to pay for property. This trend then eventually spread across the world. A certain number of these loans would default, which basically means that the person who took out the money wasn't able to pay the bank back. This was okay for the banks because they would simply reclaim the property, and because this was a time when house prices were on the up, they could simply sell on the property, therefore making a profit. And this is when the problems started to happen. You see, house prices tend to work on a cycle of supply and demand. When more people want to buy a house, they are more willing to pay higher amounts of money for them, therefore the price goes up. However, this level will eventually get so high that most people will not be able to afford to buy a property. Therefore, less people are buying houses and the price has to drop again, and then the cycle repeats itself. So, when house prices started to go down, this was bad news for the banks. They started to have to sell the houses for less than the loans that they had given their clients, therefore making a loss. Fast forward to the present day, and the gist of it is that banks are losing so much money that they're going bust. This has led to a freeze up of the markets, which is when banks aren't willing to lend to each other, purely because they're not sure that the bank that they lend to, they're not sure whether it's going to go bust the next day or not. Now, number two, what are we going to do to get ourselves out of this mess? Here is what would happen if we didn't intervene. The big banks that made huge profits by offering these kinds of loans that are now going bust would eventually collapse. This would mean short-term chaos, not just for the business and financial world, but also for normal people who rely on banks for their savings and also for things like an overdraft. The collapse of the bigger banks would leave us with the smaller banks that decided not to instigate these high-risk loans. They would eventually grow and take the place of the bigger banks, and then after a while, financial normality would be restored. Governments around the world don't seem to be willing to let this happen, purely because of the initial chaos that would happen in the financial world. What they intend to do will depend on where you live. In the UK, Gordon Brown has instigated a nationalisation plan, in which the government has bought up the banks, and this basically means that most banks are now state-owned. This means that the government should have some kind of control over the bank's behaviour in the future, which potentially means they have the ability to avert a similar crisis any time down the line. Powers in mainland Europe are also talking about putting into practice a similar kind of plan. In the USA, the Bush administration has decided to take a slightly different approach. Instead of taking control of them, the government has decided to give the US banks $700 billion, which will be used to pay off the toxic loans that the public can't pay back. There is, however, a call to consider a similar kind of plan to that of Britain and the rest of Europe. Regardless, both tactics have been seen as controversial, with outcry from the taxpayer who doesn't see why they have to pay for the mistakes of the banks. Whether this is fair or not is up to you. In terms of how this will affect us in the future, there are conflicting opinions. On the one hand, there are those that say that this is simply a blip in the radar. Others are considering this the beginning of another recession. In the UK and Europe, seeing as we can assume that the governments are going to have a say in the proceedings of the banks in the future, we can hope that money lending will become more responsible. However, in the US, those that made these mistakes in the past are simply being bailed out without a scratch on them, and there's a huge danger that these people will continue to make the same mistakes well into the future. Regardless, in the next few years, I'm afraid I think we're going to have to wade through an awful lot of crap. We're going to have to deal with the rise of unemployment, fuel poverty, and less money to spend on the high street. It is up to those in charge to make sure that we can survive, whether this is simply a blip or something bigger. I certainly hope that helped. I've been BrainBoxx. Thanks for watching.